Good morning, everybody. My name is Torres. I'm a first year here at the Honors College, and today I'm going to be talking to you about hemp, Kentucky, and the Civil War. So all of you have heard of the Cotton Kingdom of the South. Well, today I'm going to give you a little introduction into what I like to call the Kentucky Hempire. So, without further ado, let's begin. So this is a quote by Dr. James F. Hopkins, who has been famously known for his work on the history of hemp in Kentucky. And he argued that without hemp, slavery might not have flourished in Kentucky, especially because no other crop was as necessary of slave labor as hemp. Yeah, they did grow grains and flax, but that wasn't as dependent on slave labor like other crops such as cotton. Another historian, the state historian of Kentucky, I actually had the pleasure of talking to him, Dr. James Clotter, argued that hemp was the money crop for this state, producing most of the profits made in the state during this Civil War era and during its colonial period. A third historian, though, named Dr. Clark, he actually argued that hemp was most influential in binding Kentucky to the Cotton Belt, the Confederacy, rather than the Union, because of how it was used for slave labor. And that got me thinking, well, if hemp was very essential to Kentucky and it was obvious that they were probably going to join the Confederacy, why did they side with the Union? That's my thesis statement, that the industrial production of hemp in Lexington, Kentucky specifically, helped influence the state's decision to remain in the Union during the American Civil War. So yes, hemp did help secure this allegiance, but before I get into the how, I want to take some time to talk about the why. Why was Kentucky so important to the Union cause? Well, here's a map. Right there is Kentucky, and this is the Ohio River. The Ohio River was very important because if the Union were to lose Kentucky, the Union troops would have to cross this river to invade enemy territory. And the Ohio River is not just this little trickle of water. It is a big river, and it would be very difficult for the Union to continue its assault during the Civil War. But there was also some social, more personal aspects to it. Yes, there was strategy, but Lincoln himself was born in Kentucky, with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, being born in Lexington, and his best friend, which would later be a little controversial, in Louisville, living on a hemp plantation where he himself used slave labor. Yeah. So, Lexington was actually known as the Athens of the West, and it was famous because of how it used industry as well as agriculture, and it's also just a beautiful city in general. So getting into this mix between industry and agriculture is hemp production. So like I said, hemp wasn't the only crop that was cultivated in Kentucky, but it was at the forefront of trade for the state, with Lexington as the center of production and Louisville as the chief distributor of the crop within the state. Another interesting thing was that this hemp was actually used to make bagging and rope, and at the time, rope was really one of the big things that they used for because they didn't have duct tape, they didn't have zip ties. How are you going to put everything together? Well, you used rope. And the supplies for this were also used for the cotton industry. Because cotton is baled. What do you bale it with? You don't want to use that same cotton to package it up. You use hemp, a more inferior crop to an extent that could be used to bale the cotton and ship it overseas. Even more interesting, Lexington was at the center of the Kentucky slave trade, providing a lot of the slaves that were utilized on southern plantations. But at the same time as the hemp industry gained more popularity within the state, they gained a valuable ally within the famous politician, hemp farmer, and slave owner himself, Mr. Henry Clay. So some of you may know of Henry Clay for his great political compromises, his inability to obtain the presidency, but he was deeply loved by the people of Kentucky, especially the farmers who dubbed him the Prince of Hemp. Because he did a lot of work for these hemp farmers. He was a hemp farmer himself, so it benefited him to do this. And one of the ways that he tried to do this was what he called the American system. And he wanted to implement these protective tariffs that would ensure that Kentucky hemp could compete against foreign variations of the product, such as Russian hemp, which was very popular at the time. What Clay also believed in was the importance of securing a market for these farmers, because yes, they're producing all of this, but they want to make sure that there's a market for it. And he looked to the US Navy. because to him, the argument was during times of war, the Navy does not want to depend on foreigners to provide these supplies. War breaks out. How are you going to get that from Europe to the United States? You won't. So if you have all of this hemp being used to make ropes, sails for Navy ships, and you have it in America, you can ensure that you have a steady stream of supplies, and it gives you an advantage against the enemy while you're at war. And after a series of letters, and Clay was very persistent, he convinced the Navy to make Kentucky its official hemp dealer. And after this, sadly, on June 29th, 1852, the Honorable Henry Clay died. This was only 9 years before the onset of the American Civil War. Abraham Lincoln had always cared for the Union even before he became president, and Henry Clay was his hero. So when he died, Lincoln wrote a eulogy to Clay, but rather than standing up there and just talking about how great Clay was, he acknowledged that Clay was a slave owner. But he did this in a very interesting way. The Union was already on the brink of collapse. He knew that at that moment, the Union was at a threat. Secession could have possibly been an issue. So what he did was, instead of talking about how slavery could be eradicated immediately, he talked about how, like Clay, he believed that slavery could not be at once eradicated. Something that Lincoln later adopted in his presidency when he started proposing gradual emancipation. But some people didn't agree with it. Kentucky didn't agree with it. They did not want compensated emancipation, which was receiving payment to give up their slaves, and they just did not want to give it up. It was a part of their way of life. And as a result, on May 20th, 1861, Kentucky declared its neutrality, what they called armed neutrality. They weren't going to let troops invade into Kentucky. They wanted to stay neutral. And Lincoln did not like this. He had some very strong words to say about it, namely that it recognized no fidelity to the Constitution, no obligation to maintain the Union, and President Lincoln went as far as to say that it was treason in effect. Kentuckians didn't like this. It didn't sit well with a lot of people. It made them nervous. What was Lincoln going to do now that they had been labeled as such? But, you know, even though they were indeed pro-slavery, a lot of people really did love the Union, like Clay did. And this is a political cartoon that was very popular at the time. It was circulated by a lot of people. And what they thought was that by remaining neutral, Governor McGoffin, who was the governor of Kentucky at the time, was practically letting the Union die at the hands of the Confederacy. At the same time that Lincoln was doing all of this to convince Kentucky to act, so was the Confederacy. By staying neutral, the Confederacy thought that they were being loyal to Lincoln. And as a result, they shut down their markets to Kentucky's hemp. And this infuriated so many people in Kentucky. And at this moment, there was nothing binding them to the South, economically at least. So, on September 2nd, 1861, when Confederate General Leonidas Polk decided to march into Columbus, Kentucky, the state was ready to throw its hands up in the air and pick a side. So here are two images: Joshua Speed, namely, like I said, Lincoln's best friend, and also Joseph Holt, who's very important in Lincoln's work trying to get Kentucky to remain in the Union. He was actually from Kentucky, and he worked alongside the president to ensure that Kentucky did not leave for the Confederacy. And after Speed witnessed the events in Kentucky, he wrote a letter to Holt where he said that neutrality died here last Tuesday night so suddenly that a coroner would be justified in issuing a writ of inquiry to ascertain whether it was a case of suicide. That one invasion was enough to convince people that they were no longer going to side with the Confederacy. And on September 18th, 1861, Kentucky officially declared its allegiance and remained in the Union. Behind me, this is a picture of the Battle of Perryville, one of the most important battles fought on Kentucky soil and one of the bloodiest, with most of the casualties of Kentucky troops. So why is this important? Why does it matter? Well, only a few months after Kentucky pledged its allegiance to the Union, Lincoln started talking about gradual emancipation again. And the Kentucky legislators met, and they said, look, we have a lot of slaves, but we would be willing to give these up to ensure and protect the state of the Union because we love the Union. But the Civil War is not about slavery, so we are not going to do it. That's what they told Lincoln. They were tired of hearing that the war was about slavery, and they weren't going to get rid of it. And then, little did they know, something would happen called the Battle of Antietam. Even though this was largely considered to be a draw, it gave President Lincoln the opportunity to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, effectively ending slavery in the Confederacy. Now, this did not necessarily mean Kentucky couldn't keep its slaves because the Union was intact, but Kentucky could no longer ship their slaves south. They could no longer sell those on Confederate markets. And at the same time, that meant they were next. This is why this is important, because a lot of people at the time did not want to acknowledge that the Civil War was about slavery, but Lincoln himself would argue that everyone at the time knew that at least a little bit of it was about slavery. So hemp really was at the forefront of this because of how it allowed for the economic necessity for slavery, the political necessity, and the social necessities of slavery within the state, something that would influence both the legacy of the bluegrass as well as the faith of the nation. Thanks so much, everybody. These are my references, and thank you.